Hello.
Hi Nick, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm really well. I'm really excited to be talking to someone who has lunchtime at the same time as me. And I feel like before we start talking about ENS, which I obviously have so many questions about, I would love to just know what it's like being a Kiwi in crypto, and especially with the time zone situation. Like, what is your life like? And like, genuinely, what are your operating hours?
Yeah, I when I joined crypto, I was living in London actually, and
Hmm.
things are reasonably reasonable there because there's a lot of people in Europe, and people from America generally understand what meetings with Europe are like. Moving to New Zealand, Europe has become the big problem. Actually, that's pretty much 12 time zones apart, and it's makes it difficult. The I guess it hasn't been too bad, but mostly because people are prepared to be a bit flexible on meeting times, and so am I. I tend to I start work around 8 or 8:30. Tend to have meetings first thing in the morning, and then a long period of peace during the day when I can get proper work done, and then occasional evenings around sort of 7 to 8. So I have a gap. I quit work around 4:30. We have family dinner and put our daughter to bed and everything, and then uh,
Hmm.
pick up with meetings sort of in the evening, which are blessedly infrequent, but a couple of times a week.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've got my schedule is sounds very similar to yours actually, except that my hours like start a little bit earlier and go a little bit later, but maybe that's just because I have like more um family time in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm starting to think that like 4 a.m. starts are not sustainable and that I should maybe like move it closer to 7 or 8. But yeah, that's really interesting. And I can imagine that being in London also just feels like you're where everyone else is, whereas like New Zealand is quite removed.
Pretty
And
much, yeah.
yeah.
It's actually more than meetings. It's an issue with people I work with closely on my
Mm.
team. Those of them who are in Europe, I catch up at the end of their day and the end of my day. And so there isn't a lot of overlap to do sort of longer meetings or peer coding or anything like that. And if they have a question, they kind of have to wait until I wake up to ask it and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So it does tend to slow down that sort of collaboration a bit.
Yeah. And before we kind of dig into the ENS team, I feel like even just like thinking about domains as an idea or a concept of something that we deal with, almost everyone deals with a domain in some way uh, in the course of their day. Yet it's one of those things that we never really stop to completely understand. We kind of just take it at its surface level, that I put in a domain name in a browser and I go to a destination. I almost liken it to this experience that I've had with like concepts around and ideas around money and currency and kind of what Bitcoin did to illuminate, and just like make people stop and question like what is money. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like for me, ENS has made me stop and think, wait, what is a domain? So I wonder if you could kind of help me out because I don't feel like I'm any further to like really grasping the key concepts and maybe just the difference between a Web 2 domain, so like that would relate to DNS, and then in Web 3 with ENS, like what that looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is really straightforward that we have these computers work best with identifiers that are have a low chance of collision, so that everyone can have a unique identifier, and that means that they have to be long, relative to what a human deals with, and that are like fixed length and sort of easily dealt with by programs. And those are all things that work really well for software, but not so well for humans. And so in the Web 2 world, we had first IPv4 addresses, which everyone recognizes, 192.168.0.1 sort of thing, and then IPv6 addresses, which are 4 times as long. And then in the crypto world, we have account addresses like Ethereum addresses, which tend to be even longer. They're 40 hexadecimal characters, um, and these all work very well for computers because they have all those nice attributes, but they work appallingly poorly for humans. We can't even recognize our own account address except by the first and last few characters, much less
Mm-hmm.
remember it or type it. And so, in the traditional world, this problem was solved in like the 1980s with the introduction of DNS. And, the basic insight is just we'll manage a human meaningful identifier system, which, we allocate according to some sort of hierarchical rules, and let people map from human readable identifiers like that to machine readable identifiers like IP addresses. And when I came to Ethereum about less than a year after launch, there was no sort of recognition that the same thing made sense for Ethereum or for crypto naming in general. There'd been some brief discussion of like a name system before launch, but it was extremely rudimentary. So the basic idea of a naming system is just that simple mapping, but a good naming system is a lot more flexible than that. It supports things like multiple resource types, so you don't want to just have your name be one name points to one address. You want to be able to say, well, it points to an Ethereum address and a Bitcoin address, and it also points to an IPFS site and so on. And how it resolves depends on what you're looking for. So if you enter it into a browser, you'll get the website. If you enter it into a wallet to send Ether, then you get the Ethereum address. And if you enter it to send Bitcoin, you get the Bitcoin address and so on. And the other thing is that a lot of these early naming systems or the ideas simply assumed that the name would just resolve to its owner. But that's not necessarily the case. You can want to own a name, but then point it at some other account. So, for instance, if you have a smart contract, you might want to buy a name and point it at that smart contract. That doesn't mean the smart contract necessarily owns the name. So the basic functionality of naming, internet naming in general, is very straightforward, but there's subtleties to like building a flexible and extensible name system that makes it as versatile as possible. I don't know if I've really answered your question.
No, absolutely. And so does that mean that in Web 2 with DNS that a domain just maps to like one resource, which is the IP address, and that with ENS it maps to multiple resources? And is that something that you sat down and kind of came up with, or was that like a logical next step because it seems like a very expansive way to think about things, even though like the way that you're saying, you're like, obviously this makes sense, but I can imagine that before it made a lot of sense. Like it was a really wild idea.
So DNS does get this right. The people that designed DNS back in the days kind of knew what they were doing. And DNS has multiple record types, and each record type you can have multiple of. And they can refer to a variety of different things. And so ENS borrows a lot from DNS in that regard. It's more that the early crypto naming systems didn't. They tried to invent things from scratch, and they stumbled across all the same issues that the traditional naming systems had already overcome. And I guess the question was how to build something like that inside Ethereum in a way that was both like flexible but also wasn't extremely high overhead and extremely like involved. And so the way we do that in ENS is with a layer of indirection. Basically, we have a central registry which just maintains a list of all the names. And each name has a reference to a resolver, and the resolver is a smart contract that's responsible for answering any questions about that name. And that way we don't have to build all the complexity of like every possible record type into the central registry. We can put that in the resolvers, and if we want to add new functionality later, well, we just release a new resolver and people can use it. In fact, anyone can write their own resolver. So you get a lot of extensibility and a lot of flexibility without enormous complexity and without sort of centralized upgrade mechanisms.
Wow, that sounds like a really like as adaptive as a system like should be in this space, rather than to kind of acknowledge how emergent things can be. Like I imagine that resource types, and even with people creating their own resolvers, like are there use cases that you've seen that you've been surprised by?
So there's been a few people creating custom resolvers, mostly for things like handing out subdomains and so on, where they want special functionality. Recently, we've been talking to someone who's working on an NFT token, where the owner of each NFT gets a unique ability to create a subdomain under their domain. And then the subdomain, its avatar image, will be the NFT they own. And it checks that they actually own the NFT before it lets them set the avatar image and stuff like that. So things like that are only possible, because of the flexibility of being able to write their own resolver. We've talked to other people about ideas that so far haven't come to fruition around, for instance, you can have a resolver for, say, an exchange, such that every subdomain gets its own custom account address, just like exchanges do deposit addresses, but they can all have names. So in principle, an exchange can do an integration where you send to like your account number .exchange.eth, and it automatically maps that to the right account, rather than having to like copy and paste your, they log in and then find the right one and copy and paste it and so on.
Wow. Yeah, that's really exciting, I think. And I wonder, in terms of just especially over the last 12 months with the latest kind of bull run and all the activity, especially, I feel like we're in the middle of like an NFT summer, and for those in the Northern Hemisphere at least, and so I wonder just like how much the culture and activity in crypto over the last couple of months has impacted ENS, which I imagine just like has like from where I've been kind of participating, ENS has just like skyrocketed in popularity. And so does it feel like that to you? And what has this time been like?
Yeah, it's been wild, actually. We've, we had that period not long ago, probably about 3 to 6 months ago, where gas prices were really high for a long time. And during that whole period, we were seeing like still record high numbers of ENS registrations, which struck me as wild because people were paying 5 times as much on the gas than the actual registration fee, which tells me that people really like value having a name. And, fortunately prices have gone down a bit since then, but the ENS registrations have continued to soar. And I'm sure some of that is driven by speculation. Like we've tried to structure ENS to discourage speculating on names because we want to be a useful naming system, not like a speculative asset. And I kind of think that those two things are in direct opposition, pretty much. But even so, we've seen this increase, and I like to think that a fair bit of that is driven by people just actually wanting to name their accounts because people are onboarding, people are getting involved, and at the same time, the influence and the visibility of ENS is spreading.
Yeah, it's absolutely the first thing that I tell someone to do, especially on Twitter, if they're trying to build a profile and signal to other people that they are kind of present in this community. The first thing I say is like, go to ENS if you can, by your first name.eth.
Yes.
Actually, it was so funny this morning because my daughter, my 4-year-old, we were trying to think of like her internet name, like her pseudonymous internet name, and we came up with her initials, and she said, "Wait, but that's only 3 characters. Doesn't it need to be 5?" And I kind of just like looked at my husband and I was just like, "What? Why does it need to be 5?" And she was like, "Because 3 characters cost more money." And I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I did tell her that at one point."
That's wild. The whole handle thing as well has just been completely crazy. Like I think I'm 99% sure I was the first person to set my Twitter handle to my ENS name, and it was just like, well, I created ENS. I've got Nick.eth. I should I should help promote that through my Twitter handle. But now it's like this universal in-group indicator for like I belong to the Ethereum community, and we've even seen people who have just made up a name and added .eth and weren't even aware what ENS was. It's actually spread beyond even that, and we've sort of had to reach out to them and go, hey, you should probably register that, just so that somebody else doesn't.
Wow. Yeah, and I think I guess like you being the first, and then you must have been trend setting, and then Vitalik kind of setting Vitalik.eth.
Yes. Oh, that had enormous impact, I'm sure.
Yeah. And so it's just like really interesting how something, I wonder as well, just in terms of this idea of like the importance of names, thinking about kind of identity, and then also kind of the cypherpunk movement, and like how, I guess just like the idea of like anonymity and pseudonymity, with the idea as well that kind of there is a completely different set of like value associated with like being your actual human kind of name in the world and being identified with that, which has, and I think as a testament to how firstname.eth names have taken off on Twitter. Like it clearly touches a nerve or like touches something in people. How do you think about just like those kind of different ends of the spectrum where it's like, this is my name, my real name, but also like we have this like huge anon culture potentially as well?
It's been interesting to see that arise, because when I first joined the Ethereum community, there wasn't really much of that. There's always people who like the sort of the cypherpunk ideal of being anonymous on the internet, or being pseudonymous rather. But there weren't many of them, and most people just went by their real names and I guess maybe it's something about the sort of the scope of the community and the distribution of it, that now it's large enough and entrenched enough that people feel there's value in creating a new identity just to interact with this one community. Whereas previously it was just the people who habitually pseudonymized themselves that we were seeing. It's been really interesting to see sort of the rise of it and the acceptance of it, I guess. Like it becomes fairly intrinsic that you just recognize people by their handles and don't expect a real name, and actually in some ways it feels like a throwback to like the late 90s when I was on BBSs and stuff, and everybody was pseudonymous because there was only room for this little field. And if your username was like your real name, then you were kind of outing yourself as like an old
as a boomer.
Yeah. And then came social media, and everyone started calling themselves by their real names, and now there's this shift back to pseudonymity. I don't know what the fundamental driving force is, although I suspect for some it's like not worrying about like regulatory issues, because they believe that they've anonymized themselves. But part of it, I think, is just this freedom to like create a persona that and a community that isn't going to frown at you for it after this switch back to real names for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really interesting. And I wonder as well, just in the Ethereum community, if kind of it feels like it's easy, it's just more humanized and people kind of connect with people, that it seems so kind of culturally appropriate to just refer to people by their first names. So I wonder if there's something to that. Yeah. And just in terms of what you mentioned about squatters and kind of making sure that ENS was used kind of not just for speculation, how over the last couple of years, kind of since releasing, being able to register ENS names with fewer characters, and then kind of how you look at the space moving forward, how do you think about this challenge?
It's difficult because there aren't that many like sort of levers we have, and fewer of those like directly like differentiate between people who are just speculatively registering large numbers of domains and people who legitimately want to use the system. Most of the ideas that people come up with for this are either impossible to implement, like counting whether the name's actually being used because we don't even know if it's being resolved, or easily gamed, like requiring people to set up records and stuff like that. So we've sort of focused, like we don't want to prohibit any use of ENS. Like we believe we're building like an open and an accessible ecosystem. So we certainly don't intend to like say squatting is forbidden, because, well, for a start, how would we even do that? We're building what is intended to be a decentralized system, and we have no mechanism, nor should we, to like ban people from using it. But we try and sort of structure the economic structures to discourage it. So one thing that's frequently raised with ENS is, why do you have like annual renewal fees rather than just a one-time registration? And the whole discouraging speculative registrations is part of that, because either you set your one-time registration fee so high that it's inaccessible to a lot of people, or you set it a lot lower, and all the names that people perceive as valuable will be snapped up by squatters, who then have no incentive to ever let go of them because they've got no ongoing cost to holding them. And so by setting an annual fee, we at least say, set up an incentive system where squatters have to sort of rationalise which names they're sitting on, and release the ones that are least useful to them or least likely to be resold. And that kind of unclutters the namespace. And all of this comes from basically a fundamental intuition that the easier it is to get a name that is meaningful to you and useful to you, the more useful the naming system is to you. And so if all the names, if all the popular names of all the meaningful names are set on by people trying to resell them, well, first of all, you probably won't even be able to find the person who's trying to sell it and then buy it off them because the market's fragmented. Second of all, they probably demand an unreasonable amount of money for it. And so instead you spend a lot of time trying to figure out variations and less, useful names. Like if you were, if like me, you joined Twitter late, or at least it seemed late at the time, you had to go for some like long handle, and it feels a little like that, So renewal fees are one of the main mechanisms, and so like the reason that 3 and 4 character names are disproportionately expensive is because there's so few of them. If we charged $5 a year for a 3 character name, one person would have come in on day one and bought up every 3 character name and then resold it at like extortionate fees because they know that it's worth holding on to more or less indefinitely for the chance to eventually sell it to someone who wants it. So it's something that's like it's a blunt instrument in some ways, but it seems to have worked reasonably effectively as judging by like the expirations to try and keep the namespace open and available. And most naming systems, if you look at some of our competitors, they tout like how many names they have registered as like their sole meaningful metric. But we actually look at like expiring names as to a degree as a valuable metric because it shows that these were names that were not productive that people can now register if they want, rather than sitting around making the namespace more cluttered forever.
Yeah, and I wonder just in terms of like that namespace space and just the kind of societal and cultural legitimacy that a namespace has, and this idea that like you can just kind of obviously create like an unlimited amount, or like you could kind of just settle on what a community or a society deems to be legitimate. And so, yeah, I wonder just in terms of how ENS has obviously gone down just like the .eth path, like what does that legitimacy grow into where you're kind of just like funneling your focus and trying to make this single thing the best that it can be?
Yeah, it's both a legitimacy thing and a network effect, I think, really. That like we've tried to sort of really stake it out and say, we created .eth because we needed some extension, to build ENS on. But we want to be good citizens and work well with the rest of the naming system. And so we basically, unlike a lot of other naming systems, consider ourselves to be a sort of a citizen of the global namespace, the one that includes DNS. And so we actively integrate it. At the moment, you can register a .xyz domain inside ENS and use it just like any other ENS domain. And in fact, right after this call, I'm rolling that out to all the other TLDs that have DNSSEC, which is the security extension we need, enabled. So it'll be possible to do it on pretty much every TLD, with the exception of a few that haven't rolled that out. Because our goal isn't to sell names, our goal is to build like a useful namespace, and we believe that the legitimacy is to work with the existing systems for that, wherever possible. While, on .eth we can offer unique sort of crypto native things that just weren't possible in the old system. It's a difficult barrier for anyone sort of wanting to come up with their own system, as you say, the legitimacy of this namespace is what you should recognize. And it gets even more difficult for wallets and so on who have to decide what naming system they're going to use, and legitimacy plays an enormous factor in there. And especially so when there's the possibility of collisions, because one of the most harmful situations for users would be where different wallets resolve the same name to different naming systems. You have a situation where I go, oh yeah, just send it to Nick.eth, and then you go and use Foo Wallet, and it turns out that Foo Wallet uses some ENS fork instead of ENS, and you send it to foo.eth and it arrives at a squatter instead, or a scammer. So we work really hard to sort of emphasize that, like, sort of cooperation with the rest of the namespace to avoid that sort of thing.
Yeah, I feel like you just dropped like a significant piece of alpha with this like update that you're rolling out, and so I just wonder if you could like tell me a little bit more about
Sure.
that.
Yeah. So we rolled out the initial DNS integration for ENS like 2 years ago now, I think,
Mhm.
just for .xyz, and the intention was always to roll that out to more top-level domains. XYZ was sort of the test bed,
Mhm.
and so we've made a bunch of changes and improvements to the code since then. We've tried to improve the gas efficiency a bit. We've also made it work with a wider range of algorithms used for the proving system we use. We've improved the UI, and we've set it up so that it can work on any TLD without us having to spend like all the gas on Earth deploying like all 2,000 or 3,000 or however many there are now TLDs separately. Um, so, basically once that's rolled out, you'll be able to just type basically any second level domain into our manager app, and it will take you to the same claim page you currently see for .xyz, and you can submit a transaction to claim that name as your ENS name as well. And so you same thing as the current XYZ one, you have to set up a DNS record that proves that this account should own this name on ENS, and then we go check that, basically. And yeah, it's something we've been working on for a very long time. We know a bunch of people have been waiting for it. It's been an issue of like sort of priorities and just the complexity of the code, because it does some like it imports a whole lot of crypto in the sense of cryptography stuff into crypto in the sense of cryptocurrency,
Mhm.
and none of it was designed to work together. So it's been a real challenge to build it to function properly.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible and so exciting. And I think it just kind of also gives you kind of a peek into a future where uh, this kind of these domains are extendable in ways that people just I think because of the way that you'll be able to use domains, the internet will feel a lot more functional and a lot more like home. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely, I think it tends to like build out this vision of the metaverse, which is like it's one thing to use the internet as a browser, like just to get a news feed or something like that, but it almost feels like you're not really utilizing the magic of like what could be the internet,
Mm-hmm.
and like simply through this work with ENS and what is happening here, it feels like it is, the portal to that world.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I guess you know, original goals for ENS were fairly modest, but we've since
Mm-hmm.
decided that like we've built this really flexible system. It'd be a shame to use it just to resolve Ethereum addresses, and there is an awful lot of that stuff that it can now address, and that like people are really engaging with and expanding on and so on. It's always gratifying to wake up and find that somebody's built something that makes this more powerful and interesting and useful, while I was sleeping, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder in terms of just wallets and how crypto wallets are developing, and especially, this idea of PFPs or profile pictures and
Mm-hmm.
NFTs being associated with identities. How has that all kind of been just coming up for your team and yourself? And what are you excited about in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the shifts we've seen recently in general for wallets is this. I think it's now a fairly safe assumption that people assume a wallet should support ENS rather than, the other way around. So
Mhm.
that makes it a lot easier to sort of build integrations and to get that sort of adoption that's needed for it to be a really useful naming system. Because, there's a really strong network effect here that if only a few wallets support it, then there's not much point getting it. But if most of them support it, then everyone has one. Um,
Mhm.
in terms of the whole profile picture thing, that's really cool. We've been working on like a minimum viable or a proof of concept
Mhm.
for supporting NFTs as profile pictures in ENS. So the idea is there's already an avatar field in ENS
Mhm.
names that you can set to specify the avatar you want to be associated with your name. And that wasn't widely adopted across wallets yet, so we're sort of pushing for that to get adopted a bit more, because now the other thing you can do with our proof of concept is you can enter an identifier that identifies an NFT you own, and then it will look up the NFT and it will fetch the image and it will show the image. And so in the next version of our manager, there'll actually be like a visual picker where you can like you open a box and it's got a list of all the NFTs you own. You can just click on one and set that as your profile picture in ENS, which will mean that every app that you sign into using Ethereum that supports ENS will just show that profile picture, which would be really cool.
Wow, I think that this would go such a long way in terms of, this idea of Ethereum single sign-on, and what we currently deal with Facebook and Google in particular, or Twitter, and just kind of making this idea of single sign-on not so daunting and really accessible and almost, I guess, comparable. So it doesn't feel different. Like, sure, fundamentally, like one is very centralized and one is decentralized, which has huge implications. But I wonder in terms of, I think especially at this 0 to 1 onboarding point of the funnel, we always talk about, the next 10 million or 100 million users. How do you think that, that inclusion of the PFP into an ENS, like a .eth address, will potentially like promote onboarding?
I think it makes it more of a coherent profile rather than just like an authentication mechanism. Authentication's a long, boring word. Profiles are exciting and people like to build them and configure them and customize them, And if you get the sense that like you sign in and you're bringing all of this stuff with you automatically without having to do anything special, that makes it a more compelling proposition than just, oh, hey, you don't have to enter a password here, But in general, like the whole sign in with the ENS thing is also, with Ethereum, is something that's really taken off lately. And we recently put out a call for proposals to implement that using, basically the idea is implement a traditional OAuth server, which is a way that most of these sites do federated sign-in. So, they ask you, do you want to sign in with Twitter or Google and so on. Implement one that supports sign-in with Ethereum. And that would mean that so many applications that currently just support Twitter and Google and Facebook can just plug this in and instantly have Ethereum sign-in available, and it can become a true standard.
Yeah. How's that RFP going, and what have the submissions been like?
So I haven't been directly involved with reviewing the submissions. It's one of the few things that I haven't touched because I've been trying to focus on this other stuff. But Brantley, my director of operations, has been reviewing it, and he said there's some really good submissions. So it's the difficult decision of going through them and figuring out which one is the best one to accept. Has the most credible and best chance of execution.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so in terms of the team and even just the direction that you take and then building that out, how much of that roadmap and that vision is internal versus like sourced from the community?
I think at the moment it is largely internal. Like we're looking at, what we see as the shortcomings, based on feedback from the community, but not driven by them right now. And that's something we'd really like to change. Like we're focusing a lot on how best to decentralize ENS. We've advertised that we wanted a governance lead to help us think about, the best ways to make ENS a more decentralized entity and to be more, soliciting of community feedback. I think the biggest problem we've had in the past when we've tried to do this is getting the degree of engagement you need to really make a roadmap and make decisions. Most communities are fairly small. They have a few dedicated members, and they have lots of people who swing by and drop off one comment and then disappear, never to be seen again. And it's difficult to run an ecosystem on that basis. So part of it is finding ways to sort of drive sustained engagement from people who have a real interest in ENS, want to see it succeed, and can offer in-depth thought through feedback as opposed to from a position of only half understanding the product in the first place. So it's not that, we very much want to be community driven, but we need to do a better job of building a community that can facilitate that first.
Yeah, and even just this idea of that governance would be hard to generate, even just in kind of sheer volume, the amount of engagement that you would need to feel like that governance was representative of the community. I'm almost getting kind of free rider vibes in terms of the public goods problem with ENS, which to me is so clearly a public good in Web3. And I'd love to know kind of how you think about it and what, even just better understanding the business model and kind of structure behind ENS and how that all works, and then how you kind of think about, dealing with that aspect of it.
Yep. Yeah, no, we 100% view ENS as a public good, and it kind of drives how we have built it. That this is why, for instance, you can register DNS domains. From a business point of view, it's probably a terrible business decision, because every DNS domain someone imports is registration fees. They're not paying for a .eth domain. But the purpose of ENS isn't to bring in registration fees, it's to build a naming system. And the fundamental reason we have registration fees for .eth is primarily to avoid them all just being snapped up and resold. And so that sort of fundamentally that drives how we think about pretty much the whole ecosystem. The somewhat perplexing thing is that in doing this, we've brought in a substantial amount of registration fees that kind of incidentally, and so part of the next stage of ENS, I think, is finding ways for legitimate decisions over how that should be used to improve the ecosystem, whether that's ENS or the wider ecosystem. I think that legitimacy has come up a few times in this conversation, and I think it's relevant here too, because we want to make sure that any decisions we make that have a large impact on ENS are seen as legitimate, and are legitimate in the sense that they took into account what the people who have a stake in it, and by that I mean the people who have contributed and participated and used ENS, would want, and is best for them.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing when you think of the reach of ENS in terms of the community. I would almost say, aside from like literally holding Ethereum, that ENS would be definitely one of those kind of protocols that a huge percentage of the community would have exposure to. And so that is really exciting. And I guess like on one hand, it's very positive, and then on the other hand it also just like comes with a whole lot of potential like responsibility. Maybe
it's a little intimidating. Like I ENS started off as a side project, and I never really expected it to become my full-time job, and much less to become like the lead of an organization with we're up to like 7 full-time employees now, which is small, I know, but by my standards is pretty big, given I never intended to actually start it in the first place. And you're right. Like I think ENS's reach is huge. I did some stats recently, and there's approximately 80,000 Ethereum addresses have either currently own or have previously owned an ENS name, which is enormous.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, it's also really helpful to just hear numbers, which I don't think we hear enough. And I definitely can feel like, and this is probably just a reflection of my own Twitter following habits, which is that I need to follow more people. But, the crypto Twitter can feel like quite small, and just this idea that, especially within the Ethereum community, you're only kind of like 2 or 3 degrees removed from someone else. But to even just think that, 80,000 addresses, like that is a huge number. And I think I would love more context with kind of real world numbers and things like that, to kind of just grasp, it's so easy to talk, globally and about the future and about kind of the planet and things like that. But really getting an idea of where that number, I think it is important.
Yes. Yeah. It's, I think what the thing I like about that number is we have on the order of about 200,000 currently active domains, and that's a really good denominator there. That the average number of domains is like 2. It means that it means to me that most people are buying the domains to use them, rather than there are a few accounts, of course, that have oodles of them, but most people buy domains to use them. I think just based on the fact that the average number held by an account is quite low, which is really what I want to see. If I'd come better prepared, I'd have other cool numbers for you. One of my favorites is the like number of registration years each month. I think I did it a while ago, and it was something on the order of like over 10,000 years. If you just like strung all the registrations end to end.
That
So
is something I actually like personally think about every time gas is low. I'm like, oh, I should just like go ahead and like register, like extend for another 5 or 10 years. So, and how do you think, just in terms of kind of like gas and again this friction with onboarding and the cost associated with it? I know, obviously, in terms of doing your best to make sure that it's not a speculative kind of asset or instrument. How do you kind of just deal with the fact that gas has such a role to play?
um, it's it's difficult because we don't have the easy solution that some platforms have of, oh well, we'll just deploy on an L2. First
Mm-hmm.
of all, because there needs to be one authoritative source for ENS. So unlike, say, a DeFi protocol, we can't be like, oh, this is ENS on mainnet and this is a separate ENS on L2,
Mm-hmm.
on some particular L2. And also because we think it's much too early to like pick a winner and say this will be the L2 and we're going to move to it,
Mm-hmm.
So we're working on solutions. We have something called Durin, which is basically a general purpose protocol for looking up resources off chain. And the idea here is that you can say like every subdomain of wallet.eth is hosted on L2 of your choice, or it doesn't even have to be an L2. It can be a
Oh,
database
right.
or whatever. But with a proving system, so that basically the client goes off and fetches the data from there, and then it brings it back to the original contract and says, check that this is valid, and then that contract can verify that the data returned from the off-chain system was accurate. And so it provides you with all the scalability of an L2 with the security of verification on the L1. And that will be enormously helpful for things like wallets wanting to hand out a subdomain to every user, and just users who want to update their content frequently and stuff like that. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help directly with registrations. And, we have some ideas on how to potentially facilitate that in the future. There are sort of, extensible bits we can plug into, but it will
Mm-hmm.
be tougher, and it will mean picking like an L2 for registering .eth names, and even if ultimately the registry is held still on Ethereum, the being like, this is the way you can do it gas efficiently with this one platform. In the meantime, we're basically just trying to optimize our code as we update it to try and reduce the amount of gas overhead, which runs in direct contradiction, of course, to the fact that we're also trying to add new functionality, which naturally costs gas.
Yeah. And I wonder, just in terms of like what now, you just like mentioned a couple of big features or rollouts that you are in the process of releasing. And I wonder, kind of after that chunk of features has been released, like what is the next kind of big problem that is on your mind, or maybe isn't even on the roadmap, that's kind of keeping you up at night about ENS?
I think it's mostly almost exclusively about L2 and scalability for us. So we've got the basic framework for how to do Durin and this look aside sort of thing to L2s. But then after that comes things like moving other parts of our infrastructure, either adding L2 support or just outright moving bits of it to a more scalable platform. It's been the case for a long time that if you want to register a 5+ character name, the gas costs more than the actual registration fee.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, it's unfortunate because the intended price point is a lot lower than the actual practical price point.
Yeah.
I feel like, between that and the stuff we're already working on, we've kind of got our work cut out for us for a little while. Although we are doing a big redesign of the manager to make it a lot more user friendly, but that's much more of a incremental change rather than a revolutionary one.
Wow, it's hard to believe that you have a team of 7.
I know, and 3 of
because
those are recent hires.
um, what? Oh my goodness! I feel like at definitely kind of at points in the last couple of months, I feel like ENS has like really carried the kind of Ethereum community on its back in terms of like this level of engagement and just I just think that the contribution and the value to the community is so it's so high that it's kind of crazy to hear like what sort of team you're working with. They must be all really exceptional people. And I wonder, just in terms of this idea, I know I've spoken to other developers and they kind of mention the high caliber of people who are attracted to crypto and, especially the Ethereum space as a huge signal which kind of got them interested and certainly keeps them in the space. And I wonder just like what your experience has been like with the people that you've worked with.
Yeah, it's by and large, the people I've worked with have been smart and engaged. They've been usually really good at what they do and also really interested in building something revolutionary, and I guess overwhelmingly good at working with others. Like there's very little sort of internal like strife and discord, it seems to me. Obviously it happens, but usually not amongst the people who are like nose to the grindstone building stuff, that much. And there are so many people in this community who have dedicated themselves to building public goods and to building infrastructure that benefits everyone in the ecosystem. And often, they get a lot less money and recognition than the people building, enormous DeFi platforms or whatever. And I don't mean to throw shade at them because there's some amazing engineers and wonderful people there as well. But it's been kind of, it's been surprising just how sort of high functioning and nice such a self-selected community is, and I guess it comes back a lot to sort of I'm a strong believer that the initial conditions of a community when you first start it have an enormous and lasting effect on how that community sees itself and therefore how it evolves and what behavior it sees as acceptable. Over time, people sort of self-govern to what they think the expectations of their community are, and I think that's been extraordinarily effective in Ethereum. I guess it started off with the goal of building something new and revolutionary and exciting, and people have sort of continued to take that to heart.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely kind of can feel the kindness and kind of like the niceness of people here, which is only it's kind of like equal to their I guess like competence or expertise in a particular area, which is really novel potentially, especially maybe not so much in tech, but like coming from other professional services. Like this idea that people are nice is in a corporate environment it's like laughable. And so I definitely get this kind of win-win-win vibe from in the Ethereum community, which is really great. And I wonder just in terms of, how many people have committed to building public goods and kind of spending time and energy in that space. And, I know that ENS has made huge contributions in ETH to Gitcoin and their grants rounds and things like that. I wonder how you see the public goods just evolving in this space, even over the kind of the very short term, and what you would kind of like to see to happen.
I've like sustainably funding public goods is a really difficult job, and nobody knows that better than Gitcoin, and they've done an amazing job of building a system that tries to do that. But I think it lives and dies on the fact that the community is willing to fund them and to fund and through them to fund the public goods. And that comes down as much as anything else to an attitude that these things are worthwhile, and that I may not get direct recognition or I may not get a direct reward for helping this project, except that my contribution helps ensure this project is a success. But I guess the other thing is that Gitcoin is taking a real sort of incentive-based approach insofar as that's possible to try and encourage that sort of philanthropy, to make it practical, which is something that I don't think's really been experimented with much outside crypto and Ethereum and so on. There's been talk about it, but maybe this is like the first time that we have those key components of an ecosystem that needs public goods, people who are prepared to build them, and people with both the funds and the inclination to fund them and the sort of social expectation that they do. So it feels like a really valuable time to be building public goods and experimenting with like ways that this can actually work, because so many of these things fail because there was no way to convince the individual that it was worth their contribution, instead of just relying on other people to contribute. It would be amazing to see an ecosystem that has more of these things. And part of that, I think, also comes back to the people who use the public goods for their own non-public goods, for their own systems, recognizing the contribution of the people that built that, and and helping them be sustainable, which is something that's been tried in the wider open source ecosystem with fairly mixed success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm definitely excited to see how these kind of tools and mechanisms, especially with, say, NFTs, how that might change the outcomes, even in terms of donations and that kind of relationship between the distributors of public goods funds like Gitcoin and people who are donating, and then also on the other side, the users of public goods, and that kind of that relationship, and I guess like consciousness and awareness that there might be an expectation that this isn't just like a one-way road. And I wonder, just in terms of like that cultural aspect of being in this space and these kind of social expectations, how do you feel about just, I guess, even employees or contractors of ENS and their role within a community? And like, I guess, maybe even it comes down to how much time they spend coding and how much time they might spend engaging on Twitter, which, like, obviously with a normal job is potentially frowned upon, but it's so different in Web3 because, it's essentially community building, which is like a not gross way of saying business development. And so how do you, just like as a lead in this team, think about how your team is spending their time?
I mean, I'm pretty lax, really. Everybody knows what things are important for us to be building, and how they can best apply their skills to the things we need to build. And it's, we try to hire people who are believing in what we're building and think it's valuable and want to make meaningful contributions. And so far, it's worked pretty well to say, we're not going to micromanage you. We need to know, we have our fortnightly meetings where we plan our sprint, and we write down all the things that need doing, and we roughly prioritize them, and then people pick up the tasks as they need doing. And not everything makes it onto there. Engage on Twitter. There's no like Kanban board card for that. But at the same time, like if somebody thinks it's valuable, they're free to sort of, make that the thing they're working on, basically. Like the avatar, the NFT profile picture thing came up partly as, because of that, because one of the team was like, oh, hey, I should, put together a proof of concept of this. It wasn't on the board, and, we need some degree of sanity in terms of having an idea what we're working on, so it can't always be wildly herring off after cool ideas, but having the freedom to actually do that and build the thing that matters in the moment is pretty cool as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so much of what is exciting about crypto is really being able to capitalize on this idea of what matters in the moment and to bring it to reality and have an impact that like has very real implications for individuals in the space and for the space as a whole. So that's really exciting, and I'm so grateful that ENS evolved into more than a side project, that you are on it full time. And I can't even kind of I don't think I could put a value on how having Alicia.eth has impacted my journey in kind of the Ethereum community over the last couple of months. It has been so critical. And so, thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.